Hi, my name is Torgeir Aadland, and I'm an associate professor at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. And I'm also part of Engage, Center for Engaged Education through Entrepreneurship. And in this lecture, I'm going to talk about authentic versus imitation when it comes to entrepreneurship education. And to illustrate that concept, I'm going to start with a small example using these three jars here. As you see, there are three jars with puffed rice, and it appears that for all of us, that jar number 3 has the most puffed rice. So when we're sitting here, jar number 3 appears to have most puffed rice. However, when I open jar number 3 and feel inside it, I find the bottom of a bottle inside it. And when I remove that and shake it a bit, we now see that it's no longer jar number 3 that has the most puffed rice, but it's actually jar number 2. However, again, if I open this too, we find another bottle in there. And it's no longer jar number 2 either that has the most puffed rice. It's actually jar number 1. And in jar number 1, there's no bottle. So jar number 1 has the most puffed rice. However, when we were sitting out there, we didn't realize that. It was only when we acted upon those jars we figure out that it was jar number 1 and not 2 or 3 that had the most puffed rice. And this is an example of authentic and imitation. So imagine that these 3 jars are not filled with puffed rice, but instead they represent 3 different markets. And the amount of puffed rice in them, the market size. And now imagine that you are students sitting in a classroom looking at those 3 markets. You think that market number 3 is the biggest market. However, when you go out there into the market, ask the customers or the clients about their needs, etc., you realize that no, it's not market number 3, it's actually market number 1 that is the biggest market. So that is, if we put it in the context of entrepreneurship education, a more authentic entrepreneurship education. Now let me give you some other examples of imitation versus authenticity when it comes to entrepreneurship education. One thing here over at the imitation side could be computer simulation, for instance, where the students are following a strict manuscript in their computers and are trying to do the entrepreneurial activities as best as they can. However, without an audience beyond the classroom, without collaboration with professionals, perhaps. If we move more towards the authentic side, we can find, for instance, project work, where students work for a small venture or a small business solving their problem. That could be marketing issues, or it could be problem with their products or services. Even more over at the authentic side, we find internship, where students work for a longer period in a business solving their day-to-day problems, doing their entrepreneurial activities. And all the way over at the authentic side, we find that students could also be professionals. They could start up their own business and be in a professional context, acting like professionals and experience the professional uncertainty and risks, etc. So the literature, they say that we should move more towards authentic, real-world entrepreneurship education. So let's look at what they also say about the different sides here when it comes to these extremes on this dimension here. Well, imitation is controlled contexts. The students, they have a safe context where the teacher decide on the different activities, where the teacher decide on how much uncertainty the students might experience, etc. On the other side, on the authentic side, we find more uncertain contexts, which is normal for entrepreneurial individuals to experience. On the imitation side, we often see linear thinking, going from one phase of a startup to the next phase and further, all the way to growth stage and perhaps to exit of an entrepreneurial venture. While on the other side, on the authentic side, we have more complex activities when the students encounter uncertainties or risks that needs them to alter their focus or alter their strategy. They need to focus on different activities, jumping back and forth between different activities. So it's a more complex context when it comes to the more authentic entrepreneurship education. The last thing is that over at the imitation side, we often find more academic experiences, that the students are facing academic issues, while on the authentic side, the students, they experience professional activities. They obtain professional experiences. And as I mentioned, literature, they argue for more authentic entrepreneurship education. However, let's look at some examples where that moving more and more over to the authentic side might have some issues with it. Now imagine a first example that you are responsible for a course in business planning and in funding. And in that course, you're teaching about those two topics to the students, first about business plans and then about business funding. And after that, you send the students out in an internship in a small business where they are intended to get some experience with business planning and business funding. Like Hannah here, she's in John's business and she's supposed to learn about those topics over some weeks in an internship at John's business. However, when she comes back into class and is supposed to write her essay on, well, either business planning or business funding, Hannah, she realizes that she didn't learn about neither of them. Because John, he focused on lean entrepreneurship. That was important for him. So he taught that to all his interns and all his co-workers in his startup, thus not giving Hannah a lot to write about in her essay. And this is an important issue when it comes to more authentic entrepreneurship education, because we as teachers, we cannot know what the students go through when we send them out there in the real professional world, in a professional context. Another issue here, when it comes to more authentic entrepreneurship education, is one about resources. For instance, if you want the students to start up their own venture, we might need to provide them with office space or perhaps a maker space such that they can develop their products and create their services. However, that of course costs a lot of money, and it requires space where they can sit or do their activities in the workshop. But it also requires time from us as teachers, being in this environment, understanding what they're doing, facilitating, helping them. A last issue when it comes to more authentic entrepreneurship education is that of, as I already mentioned, we perhaps don't know what they're really doing when they're out there in the professional world, in the professional context. And thus, the grading or assessment of students which are in acting as entrepreneurs becomes a bit more difficult. So when we are designing courses or programs in entrepreneurship which are more authentic, we should also plan for an assessment that handles the uncertainty and the different activities that the students might choose in this authentic context. So we see that there are a lot of issues connected to the more authentic entrepreneurship education. And if we, again, summarize a bit on what we've just saw about the imitation and authentic side of entrepreneurship education, we see that we have more safe activities over at the imitating side of entrepreneurship education, meaning that we can control how much uncertainty and perhaps risk the students or consequences that the students are encountered with. But on the other side, we find the more risky activities, which is something that the students need to experience as entrepreneur to understand how it is to be entrepreneurial. Another point is that on the imitation side, for instance, with the simulation game that I mentioned, that the students, they might miss the complexity of the entrepreneurial world if they're only doing a linear thinking, step-by-step simulation of a business. However, if we move more on over to the authentic side, students might miss some experiences. As I mentioned, if the students are facing some challenges or risks that need to adjust, that they need to adjust their course of action, or only focus on product development or whatever, then the students might drop and miss some other experiences that are also needed to become entrepreneurial and to become a trained entrepreneur. A last thing is that with being a professional, one obtains a lot of tacit knowledge. And being in an imitating environment, one might miss these development of this tacit knowledge. However, on the authentic side, one might see that we create a situation where the students might lose the analytical or academic overview over different situations and over the activities that are connected to entrepreneurship. So when we are designing courses within entrepreneurship education, I argue that we shouldn't strive for only authentic situations, but we should strive for a balance between imitation and authenticity when it comes to entrepreneurship education, such that the students are both in a safe environment where we can control things, but also get to experience the real entrepreneurial activities. Thank you.